The Templar is a fearless knight who, as the body is covered with iron, so the soul is the defense of the faith. Without doubt, fortified by both arms, he fears neither man nor demon. This is from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. This is from some of his earliest writings about the Templars. The Knights Templar, the most famous of the medieval military orders, the Crusader orders. Clearly, the Templars are an endless source of inspiration. They've been taken up by novelists, poets, filmmakers, video game designers. They've been portrayed throughout the centuries as both heroes and villains. I think one thing we can say for sure about the Templars, they tend to provoke a strong reaction. People are fascinated by them. They either love them or hate them. You don't get a lot of lukewarm responses when it comes to the Templars. So the Templars were a pretty straightforward organization in terms of their actual history. They were an order. They were an order of brother knights dedicated to the Crusades movement, dedicated to the defense of Christendom and to the protection of pilgrims. They were basically combining the idea of the monk and the knight. But despite having a pretty straightforward history, and we do know quite a bit about them from the source material, they have been transformed over time by many myths about them into almost a sci-fi-esque thing. I've heard this myth before that they discovered the Americas before anybody else. There's this idea that they discovered some secret about Jesus that then, made them hated by the church authorities. All sorts of myths about them. But one myth we can look at, and this is one that actually began in the Middle Ages, is the myth of the noble beginning and the corrupt end. And this is a commonplace myth. This is an easy way to explain a rise and fall of many individuals, many organizations in history. The idea that you start out good, you start out with good intentions, with pure intentions. Over time, you become more successful, and then corruption destroys you. Greed, you lose sight of the original goal. And of course, this sort of thing does happen, but the truth is that when it comes to the Knights Templar, this is not what history shows us. And often these attempts to make history, more palatable, easier to digest, you take the history of an order like the Templars, there is kind of this sudden end that takes place. All of a sudden, at the start of the 14th century, the French king turns against them and is able to bully the Pope into destroying the order. This all happens very fast. And this happens to an order that had been one of the most important orders in the Christian world for 2 centuries. So people look for some sort of neat and tidy explanation to this. I was recently reading A General History of the Middle Ages by Norman Cantor, his classic Civilization of the Middle Ages, and he actually repeats this myth. He says this, the Templars started off as a very popular organization. People believed in their mission, and then they became less popular over time as they became more corrupt. But this really just is not true. The evidence does not, show this. Helen Nicholson, one of the foremost historians of the Templars, if you have not done so already, you guys really should get this book that she wrote, The Knights Templar, A New History. It's one of the most digestible breakdowns of the evidence we have for the history of the Templars. And one thing she points out is that criticism of the Templars, in terms of their contemporary period, like when they actually existed, was at its height earlier in the 13th century. So long before the order was dissolved, and it had more to do with problems with the Crusades in general. Like after the fall of Jerusalem at the end of the 12th century, and there were a couple of big crusades organized and Jerusalem was not recovered, and people started asking the question, what's going on? We have this great order of the Templars that they're supposed to be dealing with this. How come they are failing at this right now? But Nicholson points out that after 1250, this sort of criticism really vanished or became almost non-existent. The Templars remained a very popular order. They remained one of the most popular orders up until the trial that was initiated by the King of France at the beginning of the 14th century. So it came as a huge shock to everyone when this suddenly happened, when suddenly the Templars in France were being arrested. So why were the Templars so popular in their day? Well, it's because the Crusades were popular. The Crusades, this idea of, pushing the Saracens out of the Holy Land, of, fighting for the frontiers of Christendom. This was mainstream, a cause that was just believed in by the mainstream during the Middle Ages. People had a lot of faith in this. The Templars, because they embodied this mission of the Crusades, became very popular. They attracted many donations, and so they became a very wealthy organization. This myth of kind of the noble start and the corrupt end, this is a way to try to deal with the chaos of history. The fact that often earlier events in history aren't even necessarily related to later events. And in the case of the Templars, the cause of their demise was the fact that they controlled so much wealth in France, and the King of France owed money to them, and he wanted to get their wealth. He wanted to get control of their wealth. And so he turned on them. Whereas previous French kings had been closely allied with the Templars. So it didn't really have anything to do with the internal function of the order, the beliefs of the order, or the behavior of the order. The truth is, the behavior of the order didn't really change over the centuries. They were, again, their organization was pretty straightforward. It wasn't like, okay, the Templars were taking their wealth and creating these elaborate, estates and places where they could indulge in wealth and a lavish lifestyle in the West. They had small houses scattered throughout the West, and these were really just centers of the collection of funds. Their big thing was shipping funds and resources overseas, getting them to the Holy Land, getting them to the frontiers of Spain, where they could, use those funds toward their mission of fighting the Saracens, fighting the infidels. This is where they built their elaborate, institutions in the Holy Land and on the frontiers of Spain, especially Portugal and Aragon. They did build these elaborate castles, these very well-designed and expensive castles. But this is not what you would have found for the Templars in the bulk of Western Christendom. They had these small houses. This is where they collected their funds. This is where they organized the transfer of funds overseas. So because the Templars were so focused on, raising and transferring money, they became very good bankers, and they became so adept at this that they acted as a bank for many of the crowned heads of Europe, the King of France in particular. And again, this is where they ultimately got into trouble. But it wasn't really because they were taking this money and using it for something other than their stated mission. I mean, all evidence shows that this is what they were doing. They were transferring an enormous amount of wealth to the east, to the frontiers of Christendom, to build castles, to hire soldiers, to finance this very expensive military operation to, deal with the crusade, to push the Crusades movement. So in terms of what makes the Templars so inspiring, I think that they embody certain virtues that when combined together are very appealing. First of all, their discipline. These were guys who lived like monks. They gave up everything. They gave up the right to own their own property, to govern their own lives. They made a vow of obedience to obey the rule of the temple. They didn't own anything themselves. Their horse, their armor, these things belonged to the order. They were using them, essentially. So they had no personal possessions. They had no personal private wealth of their own. Secondly, just their excellence as warriors. This monastic discipline, they dedicated that primarily toward the end of perfecting, their military prowess. They trained as knights. These were highly skilled warriors. The Templars were the greatest cavalry warriors of their generation. And this was achieved because of their personal discipline, because of their dedication. And I think finally, their dedication to a higher cause. Again, these were guys who gave up personal pursuits. They came from the upper class. They could have, given themselves over to a life of pleasure, a life of, personal gain, but they gave themselves over to this cause of the crusade, toward, self-sacrifice, to fighting in the most difficult circumstances, the place where the real war was raging, they went there and they gave themselves over to this life that was oriented toward this higher end. So yeah, these things combined, I mean, this is the image of the warrior monk, and this is not just an image that we find just with the Templars. I mean, a lot of fiction, a lot of sci-fi, fantasy does make use of this idea. And, we find the Templars are kind of the actual historical manifestation of this sort of thing. And it's fascinating to people. And, just the actual history of the Templars is very interesting and very engaging. So if you guys want to know more about the Templars, a couple of good places to start. Malcolm Barber's classic, The New Knighthood. Again, Malcolm Barber is a top-level scholar, one of the foremost experts on the Templars. This book is scholarly, it is highly interesting, entertaining, fascinating, worth your time. Another book you could check out is, again, Helen Nicholson's The New Knighthood. Nicholson, again, a top-level scholar. These two books are always the two I recommend if you want to get your feet wet with the Templars. They are scholarly. The problem with the Templars is the fact that there's a lot of goofy stuff written about them, a lot of, sort of fantasy literature. Even stuff that presents itself as history can actually not be very good. So you have to go to people who are actual scholars in this sort of thing. And Malcolm Barber and Helen Nicholson, these are scholars. These are medieval historians of the top caliber. These are two really good books to go to for the Templars. And finally, I wanted to say thanks to a few new patrons, some people who have started supporting me on Patreon. I've gotten several new ones lately. Jordan Hampton, Adam Price, Ed Harding, Dave Nault, St. Mercurius, Natty Burrow, and a guy named Storymaker. Storymaker is actually working on sort of a fantasy novel that deals with, kind of takes Crusades elements and combines it with almost something like Song of Ice and Fire. So interesting fantasy that he's coming up with, fantasy fiction. So thanks guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll talk to you soon.